Good afternoon. How y'all doing? My name is Jonathan Bloom, Senior. I'm a product of New Orleans. Uh, Many generations on my mother's side, at least 4 generations. On my father's side, at least 4 generations. Uh, my family was known. My mom was one of 16 children. One of the last interviews I did in this room was with her some years ago. You can go online and Google me and Shirley Bloom, and you'll see a good interview about music and the history of music based on her perspective, because she was a music teacher also. I taught 38 years in the school system, and I have a lot of students out there playing professionally. I'm kind of winding down, even though I don't feel old, but still, I'm kind of changing paths and doing some other things to try to make it a little better for kids and make it better, and trying to enhance and preserve the legacy, the culture, our progeny, the students, the legacy, the next generation. But I want to start today because I'm talking about the evolution and what happened in New Orleans and why it happened, and just to give you another perspective, because some of you are probably great scholars and you probably have done some reading, but maybe I can enlighten you on some things that maybe they don't necessarily talk about in the textbook, or they'll say about New Orleans. So I like to begin with, even though we're talking, the theme is jazz, and I want to talk about the precursor. I mean, just a little bit before this movement or this behavior started taking place. What created it? You know, what were the circumstances? What were the ingredients? What was the catalyst that sparked and inspired people to make this part of the fabric of their community, their behavior? Somebody asked me, why does New Orleans have so much going on with this and that? It's because the music became a part of the behavior daily. And we're going to talk about some of those things that are innately just New Orleans. You can go anywhere in this country, and we consider this the people who are many generations. And even when you look at the history of Louisiana, once it was purchased by the American government, they had to go back and strike a new deal because New Orleans wasn't included. We say this is not America. This is the northernmost point of the Caribbean. This is the northernmost point of the Caribbean. And there's reasons, because it's multicultural. Like most of America, you have a lot of things. But for whatever reason, certain things just stayed in place. So, you have people associate Louisiana and New Orleans as being French, but I don't know that many people who speak French here. But there's a lot of French influence. There's a lot of Spanish influence. You have Native Americans, and then you have a big core group of African cultures that really is the heartbeat of what happened and what happens here. And say, well, why was it so different? Because you had that same thing happening in other places. But because of the way people cohabitated and existed, and there was always tension. It's kind of hard to not talk about this and not bring up ethnicity and race sometimes. And a lot of it was positive because it came up with the results of it is jazz. And so as people begin, and I'm going to just start, I want to first get rid of some myths. Some people say, well, you know, this music is of the street. Yeah, it is. It's of the community, came out of the clubs and the saloons and the streets. But New Orleans was a place, and the musicians, many were educated and competent musicians, and a lot of them were not. A lot of them just had innate ability, but a lot of them had musical skills, technique, facility on instruments. So when you look in the history of New Orleans and you go back to people like Edmond Dede and Lucien Lambert, these were African Americans or free people of color who were playing symphonic music in the early 1800s. Just like in the movie, like y'all seen the movie Chevalier. Man, go see that movie, it's deep. They were our chevaliers here. And they were playing the music. By 1840, New Orleans was really starting to grow. And you had people who were coming into communities. We had an orchestra of 100 free people of color. We had more free people of color than you had in Philadelphia or New York at that time. And this was the Deep South. The Deep South. New Orleans was like the second largest port, became the second largest port in the country, the largest city in the South. Like I said, multiple ethnic groups. Then you had the experiences going down like Congo Square. How many of you been to Congo Square since you? It's basically just a fenced off area now, but when you know the meaning of it and what happened, the behavior, and you get the breadth of it, then you feel something. See, wow, this was sacred ground. Where people who were enslaved people and people who were free people of color were allowed to congregate. And the drum wasn't banned here. That's important, my drum friend over here. The drum wasn't banned here. So you heard those rhythms like the kalinda and the bambula and the dancing and the singing. And so that stayed in this community. In many instances when we lost, and I talked to some people who were from West Africa, and I was saying, man, I feel bad because I'm a hand percussionist, but I don't speak any of the languages. And we lost something when we couldn't speak the tongue. But he said, no, the other parts of it is in the DNA, and it's still here. It remained in the behavior of the people, in the music. So you started, now I'm to the Civil War and after the Civil War. This was a large port, and you had a big military presence here. So a large port of embarkation, and you had military bands. The military bands, you had people who were of color in the military. Matter of fact, where I just buried my mom, who I told y'all was 101, I buried her in a graveyard, in the grave of my great-grandfather, who was a free person of color who fought in the Union Army and is buried here. He was 16 years old fighting in the war. And so you had this military presence. And so with all of this going on, and you had nightlife, vice going on, and fun play. You had cultural things going on, from Mardi Gras to St. Joseph's Days to all of those days, the benevolent societies. That's that word up there. Somebody asked me about this earlier. See, beginning jazz history, New Orleans benevolent societies in second lines. Very, very important. The city started growing in many other ways, behavioral ways, because for many years, everybody was Catholic. But now, religiously, we started growing, and you started getting many African Baptist churches. People like Buddy Bolden, who was one of the early musicians, was a member of First African Baptist Church. My great-grandmother was a member of First African Baptist Church. Much of that influenced the music, just like the church influenced, Baptist church and black church influences the music today too. Well, all the churches do now, because you could put on some Jimmy Swaggart now and they be grooving on, and that's a big mixed church. But before they had organs and multiple different types of keyboards and all of that stuff, you know, a lot of the song went down was a call and response and shuffles and stomps and rhythm, you know. It was rhythmic. If you read the book, In Search of Buddy Bolden, he'll talk about, the author mentions stuff like that in the book, where the behavior in the church and the atmosphere of the church and what was happening. It was also places where the culture was preserved, even up until I was a kid. Well, I'm getting a little older now. I'm 65 this year. But when I was a little kid in the 60s, on Sundays, and this is before football became everything in America, you know, on Sundays, the churches would have these Lyceum series, and they featured talent from the community. And when you go to YouTube and you see the interview with my mom and I, she talks about her development in the 1920s was through that, how my grandfather would take her and her three oldest siblings, and all of them played music. The oldest sibling of the 16, my uncle Rutherford, he played in the Jimmy Lunsford band and Cab Calloway and some other bands. But he was also accomplished. He could read anything. From Flyland on a paper, he would read it. I mean, he was brilliant. He could play all kinds of excerpts from operettas and all kinds of stuff as a young kid. I'm gonna tell you, he was a really intelligent person. I don't really like to go into that, but he started college in 1932 at 14 years old. A young black kid out of New Orleans. And my mom's second sister was 14 or 15, and she was with him. She graduated at 19. He decided to go on the road and play music. And my mom was right behind him. But my mom was a classically trained vocalist, and she sang opera. She sang with the New Orleans Opera Chorus and opened up concerts for Paul Robeson. I didn't find that out till in her last days. You know, interviewing my mom. Well, that's bad when you talk to your mom and you figure you know everything about your parents, and they say, bam, I say, where did that come from? Well, I found that out. Well, anyway, so the culture was preserved in the churches. I don't want to go off too much. Culture was preserved in the churches too. There were no schools. Nobody said, yeah, we're going to learn how to play jazz like this. That was non-existent. But along come the benevolent societies in the churches. The benevolent societies. So what is the benevolent societies? So that's a group of people who decide to form this network or this club. Stand up a little bit. This club. And it could have been ties with the church, or it didn't have to be. It could just have been a group of fellas, people from the neighborhood. And every week we got together. Everybody bought their dues, their nickels, their dimes, their dollars, and they built up their pot. This was a form of insurance. This was a buffer. So when Johnny got sick, we went to his wife and said, here, Miss Smith, Miss whatever, pay the bills, feed the children, do what you got to do. Somebody passed, somebody died, we got to bury him. So the benevolent societies were a form of insurance, but it was a form of security and spiritual thing of belonging and a support. It was extended family, which meant a lot. Extended family. And so in the benevolent societies, what happened? How did that preserve the music? Well, remember I talked about those military bands. And all of a sudden around in the 1800s, you started hearing the rhythm started changing. They were no longer playing like, I'll take a march like Bugle Boy March is an old march, military march. Yum pum 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 pum, yum pum 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 pum, yum pum pum, yum pum pum, yum pum pum. Yum pum pum, yum pum pum, yum pum pum pum, yum pum 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 pum. Real straight, real toot. But then somewhere along the line, you started hearing the rhythm change. It started ragging the rhythm and the beat. Yabba dooba dooby doop dooba dooby dooby up dubba dub dooba doop dooba doop boop boop boop. Yabba dub dooba doop dooba doop be yoop dip dooba dooba doo. Doom doom. Yabba dub dooba doop dooba doop dee. Yab dooba dooba dee. Yappa biddy bidoo bidoo bee, yappa bidoo bidoo bida, yada yada, yup bidoo doo, pew, doom dabidoo bidoo, ba boom bee, you dip doo bidoo bidoo, badoo boom boom, yap. And you started hearing that big bass drum. And now, because drumming has got to be really, really sophisticated in this day. So now you hear the brass bands playing it now, and they playing it with today's rhythms. Not like they did 100 years ago, but they went from playing it straight military to ragging the rhythm a little bit, and then every generation brings something to the table. That's what I was telling this young man. That's the beauty of it, you know. The key is to preserve the past also, because like the old folks used to tell us, you don't want to throw the baby out with the water. Meaning, just because the water get dirty, don't throw the baby out on the ground. You got to hold the baby, change the water, you know. But you have to preserve that. And so in New Orleans, probably like, it's very unique in the sense that even when musicians come up now and they do gigs, whether it's a hotel gig, some kind of cocktail gig, or a convention, or some kind of party, they'll play a variety of music. They'll play the music of the radio. They can play the music of 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So the blues stayed here. And it got a little sophisticated because this was urban in the port area. And so you started hearing some different things going down because you had, and you look at some of the earlier pictures in jazz, the jazz ensembles, and a lot of them had violin players. My grandfather was 10 years older than Louis Armstrong. He died when I was in high school. But my grandfather was a violinist. He came out of that era in late, he was born in 1890. 1890. My grandfather was 10 years older than Louis Armstrong. And all of them literate violinists. I can't think of this piece he always played. It was called Thais, classical piece. But he could play hymns and he played all types of music. So that pushing all of those musicians up from the 1840s to up to the top of the late 1800s, 1890s, you have some competent people here. All of those families. And you had a lot of Spanish influence. Like some names that are still present in New Orleans culture and history, not like the Tio family. They still have musicians named Tio that play in New Orleans. And the Santiago families, old Spanish families from the 1800s. Perez, Manuel Perez, and all of those guys who were playing the music 20, 30 years, or playing ragging the rhythm and the melodies 20 years before Louis Armstrong was born. That's deep. Because I always, even as a kid, I always thought, and I knew Louis Pops was bad, and we respect him. He's our big icon here. But little did I know that there were some people before him. And I didn't think this music just came up in one day. It happened gradually. That's my perspective. It didn't happen in one night. The first generation of them were playing it a certain way. By the time it got to Buddy Bolden, who many people consider to be like one of the first true innovators, taking the improvisational part and extending it. And that was the beginning of that. So at every part there's a beginning and there's an end as the music grows. And then came Pops. He was born, well, there's some disagreement about that. I was talking with somebody earlier this morning, and we were looking at a picture of a guy named James Booker, who was a pianist from here, played real creative guy. And James Booker was one of the earlier teachers of Harry Connick Jr. And there were some pictures of Harry as a little kid like this, getting up on a piano and sitting next to James Booker, and they grooving together and doing their thing, and that was part of his experience. And the pictures were taken on the 4th of July because we started having these Louis Armstrong celebrations on the 4th of July. And the 4th of July was the day he said he was born. But somebody, lo and behold, found some baptismal records, and it said August the 4th, not July the 4th. But I don't believe that. Why? My grandfather was 10 years older than Louis Armstrong, I told you, right? My grandfather was born in January 1890, but his birth certificate said February. Why? Because most babies were born at home, and if you didn't register your child in a timely way, that was a $5 fine. So most people of that day and that time said, no, son, you wasn't born in January, you born in February. I need that $5. $5 was a lot of money. My grandfather became a postman in 1910, and he was making $20 a month. So imagine 20 years later, somebody taking $5 of your $20, you say, man, I got to survive $20 a month Ain't somebody taking 5 of them? No, you see what I'm saying? It's logical for me. Now that may not set with everybody. But then I'll take you up to about 1990. My daughter was born, and her baptismal records are wrong. Wow. So I'm just saying, some food for thought. I think Pops knew, because what we're finding out now is sometimes the oral tradition is stronger than the written tradition, because it depends on who's writing it. So we got to keep that in mind. So back to these benevolent societies. And Pops, as a little kid, he saw the benevolent parades back then. He was a kid. So those of you who with the convention down by the Hyatt, Superdome, City Hall is across the street. That's the area where he grew up. It was a rough area called Jane Alley. And the other side by City Hall, going toward the Superdome, was called Back of Town. That was rough. And where the Superdome and the Hyatt Regency is, that was nothing but railroad warehouses and an old graveyard. Nobody went back up in there at night. Dangerous. And so, but I'm trying to paint a picture of his community. And so, on Sundays, they heard the benevolent societies, like every Sunday now from September, Labor Day, after Labor Day, and they may go on a little further now, probably into the spring, you have what we call benevolent society, social and pleasure clubs, parades. That remained an integral part of this community that's been there for over 100 years. Some of them were tied to churches, like Mount Moriah Baptist Church. They've been doing that procession for over 100 and probably 20 years, maybe 30. That long. And so you'll have that same club of people we were talking about, who was the security blanket. So Mr. Smith just passed, we got to bury him. If he belonged to the church on the corner, what they would do in the earlier days, a lot of times people had wakes at their houses. The wake took place at the house. And the next day, the band would be in front of the house, and they'd be playing these slow hymns. That's what we call a dirge. D-I-R-G-E, dirge. And they play these dirges, a hymn, nothing but a hymn, but play it really, really slow. Closer walk with thee. Ba, ba, da, ba, da, ba, da, brrr, brrr. Ba-dum, bum, bum, brrr, brrr. You hear that all the way through the dirge, the song. Ya da 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 dee. Trumpet is screaming. Be dum bum ya dee 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 doom. And everybody's in step together. Be-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. You. Be-dum, bum, be-dum, bum, ba-da-da-dum. Be-dee-dum, bum, ba-doom, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum, bum. And that will go on till we get to the church. You see, so a lot of things that were part of the the neighborhood map of a community. In New Orleans, it's usually a barroom on this corner, school, church, barroom. Church, barroom, graveyard. In every community in the old parts of the city, you say, wow, there's a graveyard. You know, when as a kid, I was always afraid to go in the graveyard. But there's a lot of information in the graveyard. My mom and the old folks told me, people not going to do you nothing, they loved you. So don't be afraid to go in the graveyard. You look at the dates. I can go in the graveyard and I say, damn, why all these people died in this year? Most of the time, that was a yellow fever year. Why do you see all of these mother, infant? A lot of women died during childbirth. Old folks used to say, when a woman was having a baby, she had one foot in the grave and the other foot out, because it could have went either way. And when women didn't go to the hospital, so when they fined Louis Armstrong and them the $5 because his mom didn't get out, women didn't come out the next day. Oh, look at my new baby. I can remember even in the 60s as a kid, and look, in my family, we have 5 or 6 babies a year, so we got to keep up with the names. That many. From that 16, there's 65 first cousins, me. 65. From that 65 with my kids, they still having some. So there's about 120 something. And from that 120 something, we starting to get from that group and my kids' group. And so we average about 6 babies a year in my family. Large tribe. Large tribe. And so now children come right out of the hospital. Or you can bring a child in. When I was a kid, if you were under 12 years old, you couldn't go in the hospital. Because they didn't have the vaccination stuff in plan. So they didn't allow that. But back in Pops in them days, the child was born at home, so they wouldn't. His mom did. Somebody came to stay there and cook for him and all of that. But if they didn't get out of that house in a timely way to register, that's that $5 again. So back to the dirge. So Pop saw all of that, and that's a major piece. Because when they got to the church and they had the funeral service, the band came out, and they didn't just come out in the street saying, oh yeah, doom, 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 we're going to second line, and we're going to dance, and we're going to be doing this. No, that didn't happen. They played the dirges again, all the way to maybe to the gates of the graveyard or a certain part of that community, and we have a ritual where the band splits in half. Half the band on this side of the street, half the band on that side of the street. And the bereaved family walks through the middle of the band. And we play our last dirge, and we touch the coffin, the sign of the cross, shed our last tear, and we cut the body loose. We call that cutting the body loose. They enter to their life after death. And then the band comes back together, and that's when it starts. Didn't he ramble? Dip, dip, dee, dip, ba-doop, doop, dip, dip, da, da, bam. Dee, 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 bam, 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 dum. Beep, beep, dee, dee, dip, be, dee, dip, be, dip, dip, doo, doop, down. Didn't he ramble? Didn't he ramble? Rambling all around, in and out of town. Didn't he ramble? Didn't he ramble? He rambled till the butcher cut him down. Head was in the market, feet was in the street. Long came a lady, hey, look a market meat. Look, didn't he ramble? Didn't he ramble? Rambling all. Nah, that's one of the older ones. But now they playing a lot of new songs, a lot of popular songs that may have been radio hits all over the country, but they've taken it and that's what the new generation is doing. But when certain people go, or the old schoolers, we do it the old way for them. There was a time you can see a jazz funeral almost every day in New Orleans. But when I was coming up as a kid, before I knew what it was, I just knew something was happening. I said, man, all the people at the church, I was a little kid. And I see the bands, I see the musicians gathering and stuff. Didn't really know what was happening till later in my life. But now I can define it because people told me and I've gotten a chance to witness it. And so I've gotten many opportunities to bury some of our great elder statesmen like Danny Barker, Mr. Edward Frank, Alvin Baptiste, Kid Jordan, Ellis Marcellus. We lost a ton of people, especially after Katrina. And we preserve this culture. So that's what the benevolent societies mean as it relates, because that's a large part of the music. Some of them same songs are played during performances, whether you're in a restaurant or a club, it's all part of the entertainment thing. We practice that, we do that all the time, anytime. Depending on how important you are, would depend on how big your funeral is. Louis Armstrong had a big one. I was a kid when he died, because he died in 1970, I think. So I was a little kid. But I played with the guy who played the trumpet, who was the last one to play it. Teddy Riley played Pops' horn. He played his horn. And up until this day, if anybody passes, now the younger generation, we recognize people. I want to say they had a second line for Michael Jackson when he died here. Say, wow. So if anybody, the people here really take that serious. It's a part of the culture. They love it. And when you see the benevolent societies, they not only do that for their members, but once a year, annually, they have a day set. Like the Young Olympians, the Sudan, the Money Wasters, the Avenue Steppers. These are the names of some of the different groups. The Big Nine, the Big Eight, and they come together once a year to have their annual parade, to celebrate their community, to celebrate their presence. We're here. The beauty of life. So there's a lot of symbolism and meaning that goes around with that. And so all of that's grown out of that culture. How much time I have? I don't want to eat up all the time just saying. Because anybody have any questions while I'm going on with that? Yes. He's buried in, I forgot the name of that cemetery. It's right next to Hope Cemetery. That's it. Right next to Delgado. Right next to Delgado. And I don't know if it's marked or not. I don't think it is. And that's the tragedy of some of this, because 2 or 3 of the homes where Buddy Bolden lived is in disrepair. And that's kind of bad because, this music has taken me all over the world. And I can remember this one trip I made. It was just like a dream to me. I was pinching myself because as a kid, I can remember in 4th grade, I had a teacher named Norrie Smith. And this guy would teach us world history. And I can remember him reading and talking to us about the Phoenicians and Babylonians and Greek culture and Roman culture and this and that. And then some years later, I get to go to Greece. I played 14 cities. But the biggest thing was I had pictures of me standing in the Parthenon and Acropolis. I was like, dang. I used to, and as a kid, he would tell these stories. I had ADD in a sense, because as soon as he would start, my television in my mind would go off. I transcended the room. I was somewhere. My subjective mind was in the Acropolis when I was that age. He took me there. And I couldn't wait to get back to the States to say, Mr. Smith, thank you, because everything that I visualized in my head, I got to experience it. Money couldn't bring me there at that time, but the music did. And that's another thing. This music has created the opportunities for so many people in New Orleans. I mean, you talk to most of the musicians, and we get a room full of musicians like this, and they go to talking about all of their life experiences on the road and all of the places they've gone. Man, you'll be here forever. See, that was their college education. And so we got a lot of that, and that was big, But yeah, about Buddy Bolden, we don't know much. There's been a lot of opinions and, people speculating who he was and how he played based upon information like, according to Bunk Johnson, there's a tune called Buddy Bolden's Blues. You have some sticks, man? You want to play? Give me some sticks. I'll play. I'm a whistle. I'll whistle. I didn't know I was going to do this. He told me he was a drummer, so I said, wow, that's a beautiful thing. I love being able to help people regardless of where they're from. So, Buddy Bolden Blues, I got a chance to perform this at the Ravinia Jazz. Anybody from Chicago or Wisconsin? I got to do this at the Ravinia Jazz Fest many years ago with Alvin Baptiste. And so there this white guy walked on the stage. He had a baritone sax. I said, well, who this guy is? Lo and behold, it was Jerry Mulligan. Man, he played with everybody. Wow, Jerry Mulligan. I'm like, wow, okay. And so we started playing this tune, and Bat said, hey, man, come up front. I want you to whistle that melody. So the melody, let me see if I can whistle, get my embouchure together. That's the tune. I did that with Jerry Mulligan. I don't know if I can do that and whistle, but I'll try to play the part so you understand where one of the earliest second line grooves would have been like in the Buddy Bolden. Even though they wouldn't have played it like ragged like this, but it would have been kind of like. I'm gonna tell you another thing. Never get behind a drum kit that you haven't adjusted. Whoever played this was big, man, I can tell. But I'll simplify it as much as I can. Something like that, you know. Okay. So, and a lot of people don't know this configuration started in New Orleans. Back then, it wasn't a hi-hat. It was way down there, low boy. But the Paul Robershow band, not St. Paul, but the Robershow band, who was one of the rival bands against Buddy Bolden. They'd meet up at Palmer Park or Johnson Park up in the Carrollton area, Holly Grove area, and they have battles. And one time, some kind of way, they always had two drummers. Somebody played the bass drum. So the bass drum would be playing. The cymbal on the side. And the snare drum was always doing this. Now, in a parade beat, we won't tighten the snare drum up like this. We have it loose because you need to hear the rap and you need to hear the imperfection. So you wouldn't have it tight like that, like playing on a tabletop. So that's quite different. Somebody needed some backbeat, so they put their snare drum like this. I don't know who did that, but and there's always a preference, you know. And this is a drum town. Drums and trumpets, you know. So the Baby Dies and all of them. And we talked about one of the classic drummers of modern day, Earl Palmer, who played, and he had Edward Blackwell, who's a beast, Edward Hogan, James Black, killing drummers. Some of the present day drummers like Herlin Riley and you know, Shannon Powell, and tons of drummers. Man, I owe every drummer in New Orleans some money because I watched all of them and I learned from all of them. All of them are better than me, so I owe all of them some money because all of them are very unique. You know, Herman Jackson, killing drummer. You know, so any other questions? Somebody else had a question. Okay, go ahead. Gospel? Yeah, well, you know, that's deep down here too. You know, Mahalia was born here, right up on the river, uptown where Carrollton meets St. Charles Avenue. Carrollton is in that turn right there. Call that Black Pearl. Well, that was where she was from. And yeah, some other strong singers from this area too, who were gospel singers. And the difference was probably for a long time, Catholicism had been so strong here. And that rigidness may have kind of suppressed much of the abilities of a lot of singers because, you know, for a long time, masses were done in Latin and then everything was real. But now you go to the Catholic churches in New Orleans and it's like a show on right now. It's like, yeah, they're talking about hallelujah too. You know, so, Yeah, you get all of that. I had a cousin, she passed not long ago, Thelma Chatters. And man, Thelma just, she must have played every church in the city. So she, wherever she would go, the the ground would just be burned up after she left. It was just like it was on, you know. She could just bring in Juanita Brooks, another singer, man. I think her whole family is nothing but musicians, strong singers, strong singers. Um, yes, there's a lot. If you want to go, none but churches in New Orleans, plenty churches. I think the only thing we may have more than churches is ballrooms, but we have plenty churches. This is a very religious place, you know, very religious. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna come to you second. Let me get here. What you say?
Besides funerals, what were some other traditions that were observed with music?
Well, so, you know, you started getting that fusion, like Mardi Gras is not one event. And I'll use that as an example. Like, we coming up on Mardi Gras now. It's going to be early this year. So February 13th is Mardi Gras. So 2 weeks before February the 13th, it's on here. Everybody in the streets. It's a celebration of life. It's your last 2 weeks that you let your hair down, because on Wednesday, everybody go get their ashes and they recommit themselves to the cleansing, you know, of all the negativity, and you try to undo some of the things that you've tangled up. But Mardi Gras is one. And within that, since Christmas, the day after Christmas, you have a bunch of, again, not benevolent societies, but you have social and pleasure clubs. They should have that there too. And that's different. And you have the like the debutante societies. And so every week, when I was a kid, boy, when it got to this time of the year, I can remember my mom and them dressing up. I said, Mom, where y'all going? We're going to a ball, baby. And she'd have on her pretty dress and her hair. It never get too cold here, but they have a little half mink collar on. And everybody was dressed to the nine, meaning clean as a bar of soap. And they going out and they danced. And everywhere you had gone, they had a dance, they had a band. Live music thrived here. I caught the tail end of that early in my career, because a lot of it has faded away now. But I remember playing with this one band, Kid Johnson's band, and we played, every year we do these balls. We had about 10, 12 balls we do every year between Christmas and Mardi Gras. We played for the 22s, the Vikings, the Rhinestoners, the Bon Ton, the Young Men of Illinois, the Original Illinois, they got some more on there, I can't remember. But, and they'd have these balls, and people would dress up in their tuxedo and the beautiful evening gowns. And some of the pleasure clubs had debutantes. They were introducing them to society, the young girls who were like 17, 18 years old, and they had to wear, so if the court was made up of 5 girls and one of the girls was the queen, 6, that meant that particular club have to have 7 dances. Because each one of the princes would throw a party. Then they'd have the queen party. Then they had the ball. All separate events. So you multiply that time, and if you go to like 10 clubs, and you had, some of the clubs would have, they may not have 10 princes hosting a ball, but they'd have at least 4 if they had 10 of them. But you start to multiplying those numbers times 10, 12 clubs, and that's a lot of gigs. All the way to the last day, to Mardi Gras night. We would play to Mardi Gras night. The last crew we played for was a group of guys. They called themselves the Jug Buddies. The Jug Buddies. And so that meant a lot because music follows the money, and the money follows the music and the behavior and all of that kind of stuff. The food. In New Orleans, you got to have food, music, and money, because you're going to get something with that. And so with all of that, came with those social and pleasure clubs and the benevolent societies. All of these places had balls. Now, that's not counting what went on in the clubs, because that continued too. So you had all of that kind of music scene going on at one time. Oh, in the back, I'm sorry.
So among the musical heritage that you had from the past generation that you mentioned, were you somehow involved with Creoles in terms of their music, their language? Because you mentioned that back in the way, a long time ago, people used to speak French.
Yeah. Well,
Were you somehow have some memories of Creole songs?
I couldn't sing any Creole songs. People used to think my dad was Creole because he was fair complected. But that didn't make you Creole, because Creole was the culture. We had one of our famous Indian chiefs, a guy by the name of Tootie Montana. And one of the last, I played at his funeral too. I played at his funeral. But one of the last conversations I had with Tootie, and Tootie was a beautiful, dark, chestnut brown complexion man, good stature, because he had to carry that Indian thing. But Tootie started talking. For whatever reason, he mentioned to me in his very last conversation, he said, I'm Creole. And based upon how people would either classify people as being Creole because they were fair complected or whatever, it had nothing to do with it, because if you weren't of the culture, 5 minutes, okay, you weren't of that culture, it didn't matter. My dad grew up in uptown New Orleans, and he grew up in the lower New Orleans, the part they call the Seventh Ward, which was associated with a lot of Creole people, but he wasn't Creole. So that's something that it takes on many meanings. So when you research it, it first meant of the old world, born in this country. People of Spanish and French, and sometimes people of mixed. That started coming in as you had the cohabitation of ethnicities. You came up with that blend, and so there you go. And many of them preserve the language, which was French-based, which were hybrid languages, dialects, if you want to call them that. You go up to Cane River in northern Louisiana, and that was a strong Creole community. And it was people who spoke the language and preserved the culture. And in some cases, they all had, it was all subtle differences with that. Yes? Yeah, the Mardi Gras Indians were people who grew out of, it started with the oldest tribe that I know of is called the Wild Creole West. And it became, once that tribe grew and it split, it bore another tribe which was called Yellow Pocahontas. And so Tootie, the chief who I just talked to you about, he was from that tribe. His grandfather masked in that tribe. So, and tomorrow you'll have Darryl Montana here, who's Tootie's son. They're separate because it's talking about the fusion of Africans, or people of African descent, and Native Americans. So you got to realize, in some areas, Like in Florida, the Seminoles had as many people of African descent as they had of red-blooded Seminole. Chief Osceola, who was chief of the Seminole, the most famous chief, his wife was of African descent. The only tribe to not be defeated in battle with the government of the United States. They fought them for about 20, almost 20 years or more. And the only way they could get Osceola was they tricked him. They said, hey man, come on, let's talk about this. And when they got him in, he said, we got you now. But little did they know they broke his heart, but two or three of his most bravest warriors escaped from a hole in the ground. And when they got back to where they got back, it was on for another 15, 20 years. It was it. So there you go with it. Lisa, we have to go, or you what? What you flagging me or what? Somebody in the back had a question. They might have called it rag. You may have heard rag, the term rag, or you may have just heard the term the blues. That term jazz came in later. And it was supposedly some derogatory term because it was calling it jackass music and all of that, you know, but the music, but it took on, now in my age, my elders like Alvin Baptiste and Kid and them say, man, I don't play jazz, I play creative music. But they knew when to use the term jazz because they knew what people meant when they said that. Those people who were not trying to break something down and they were trying to express about the creativity part. And they knew that. But for the most part, they would just say, when they were amongst themselves and they talked metaphysics and music, they said, yeah, the music, the creative music. You know, they used those kind of terms. Any other questions? Oh, one more. Go ahead, see. Yeah, second line. The second line was the participants who celebrated the life of that individual. So once they cut that body loose and the band took off into the community, they visited every little water hole and spot that Joe Blow hung out at. And they celebrated his life. And it's a dance. You have to be in shape to do it now. When we played for Tootie Montana's funeral, I didn't realize it at the time. I'm in a procession, but when I look at the film, they had these two guys, and they were from a part of the city by Treme, and where it merges with where Treme leaks over into the 7th Ward. And the houses were real close together, these shotgun houses. And you could see the guys dancing on the roof and jumping from house to house. Literally. Jumping from house to house. I was like, wow, only in New Orleans. Yeah. So I hope it gave y'all some insight on what happened, my perspective, and why New Orleans is what it is, because we truly believe in this and we live this culture. We breathe it. It's part of the breath. You know, Katrina was the most dangerous moment for most of us. We lost so many people because of the possibility of this place not being able to come back. We lost more people to the stress of it than we lost to the water. About 2,000 people drowned and died. But there was another couple of 4,000, 5,000 died just from the stress of it. I was living in Houston, Texas, and I was doing pretty good at the moment, but I wasn't right. I told myself I got to go home. And I came back 6 months after the storm when half of the city was dark. And I said, look, I'm gonna either be a reason to survive or I'm gonna be the last person getting in and out, you know. I had to come home. I had to make sure that this was going to be all right. We feel obligated. We felt like we were the torch bearers. And if the music goes, that's it. Go try to watch a movie with no sound effects and no music in it. And it's just people walking. You lose the breath of it. You lose the breath of it. So that was important to us. So every time a storm come, pray for us. But I know somewhere, if there's 2 or 3 of us left, they coming back home. They're coming back home. There's a picture of me, and there's a picture of Wynton Marsalis and some other people who came home. Spike Lee was in the middle of the parade filming us on a little bitty camera. And the weight, I don't think he realized, I don't know if the country realized the weight that was on top of us for that. You know, every time I would go to my community, me and the young lady back there, we grew up in the same block. And I can remember going to meet insurance adjusters, and my neighborhood was devastated. And every time I can remember when I got to a certain point, I was like 3 miles from my house. The closer I got to a mile, I could feel it like a blanket was coming over me. It took a while to get till I knew that we were going to be all right. So if I could offer any advice to anybody in here, if you have anything of value, go home and say, if somebody come and say, in 3 hours, get out, or in 1 day, get out, take what you can in your hand, what would you take? See, because tables and chairs, we can replace that. First thing you do when you go home, I'm offering this to y'all. Every picture that's meaningful to you, get it digitized, put it on a disc. So all you got to do is put the disc in your pocket and you have your pictures. I know people who don't have any baby pictures of themselves. That's important. I feel good because my mom survived Katrina, and I was interviewing her all the way to the end, recreating and preserving the history from her generation. I remember my grandfather and all of these things, and that's important. That's important to me, at least. So you do those things for yourself. Yes, ma'am. Patrice? Oh, God, how you doing, friend? Oh, okay. You gonna play with me? No. Come on, play some piano. Don't you play piano? No. It's kind of hard for me to just do that like that. I thought I was doing that with Buddy Bolden. I don't really like these drums. I don't have no. You got some sticks, man? So I'll do a couple other tunes. I'll do short versions of them. Like one of the earlier tunes I talked about that they first started ragging was a tune like Tin Roof Blues. So, gotta go? Gotta wrap up? Okay, he said I gotta wrap up. All right. Tin Roof Blues, the drummer's doing, my friend right here, doing something really simple. It's the tune. So that's like a drag. Then you get tunes like Jelly Roll Blues, and they will play it like. But not today. A lot of the kids that I taught who like young and performing, they play it like this. now they playing tunes like, and they using funk beats. They're not using the traditional street beats. They playing just like you playing a funk band. So that's the way the drum section functions today with it. They'll play the same funk rhythms like on a record, and sometimes they'll play the song with the melody on the top, like the tune, but they'll add New Orleans beats to them, and it's kind of hard to demonstrate that. Let me see, loosen this up again, and I gotta go. Drum bad. So it's just different grooves. So it just varies. It's hard playing these drums because with those kind of grooves, you don't want the drums to resonate and ring. You want to have like a decayed sound and a sound that has more of a box sound. And these resonate and they ring. So it's hard to play them for me, I don't know what else I could do with that, and then with Indian music, it's the same thing. So they'll play Indian tunes, and there's melodies to some of those tunes like, me Big Chief got fire water. I can't hear. Chief got fire, water. Me got fire, can't put it out. Drink fire, water, wanna make me shout. Me Big Chief, I'm gone, my tribe. See, got the lyric like that with it. I don't know all of the lyrics. So, I'm sorry I didn't bring any disc with me. Examples of music, because I figured if it was just 45 minutes, by the time we go to looking at video, I wanted y'all to hear, the actual words of my perspective rather than looking at, because you could always go online now and just Google New Orleans jazz, new second line, and you're going to come up with all of the stuff. Last one I looked at, I saw somebody dancing on top of a coffin, and it's been like that. Very unique. It's very unique.